Boa tarde, bem-vindos. Mais um Tiaços, depois de um breve intervalo que a gente fez, de acho que 2 a 3 semanas, né, Lu? Tiaços volta, e hoje com alegria, bastante alegria, de receber um convidado que há muito a gente queria convidá-lo e achamos que agora foi a melhor oportunidade de recebê-lo. Professor Roderick Main. Roderick, prazer imenso te receber. Quero te apresentar para o público brasileiro, apesar de saber que você já, ano passado, né, retrasado, você fez uma apresentação aqui também para um outro grupo, que eu não me engano, acho que é o Matheus, da Universidade, não sei se de Juiz de Fora, enfim. Mas você já esteve aqui. Roderick Main trabalha na Universidade de Essex, no Reino Unido, onde ele é professor do Departamento de Estudos Psicossociais e Psicanalíticos e é diretor do Centro de Estudos do Mito. Seus livros mais recentes são os volumes coeditados Holismo, Problemas e Possibilidades e Jung, Deleuze e a Problemática do Todo. Só um minutinho aqui, espera aí que eu me perdi de vocês. O Roderick tem esse livro que é ótimo, A Ruptura do Tempo, Sincronicidade e a Crítica de Jung à Moderna Cultura Ocidental, que eu diria que é talvez o mais importante, o mais interessante e também complexo, no sentido de abordar esse tema com complexidade, a questão da sincronicidade. Recomendo bastante esse livro. E o livro mais recente, que é Jung, Deleuze e a Problemática do Todo. Esse livro é de 2021, né, Roderick? Acho que é mais recente. E onde ele tem um artigo do Roderick sobre Jung e Deleuze, e ele também trabalha como editor. Então, é um ótimo livro, interessantíssimo. Fica também a dica. Roderick, um prazer te receber. Sinta-se à vontade. Há muito tempo que a gente queria te ouvir. Espero que a gente tenha uma bela tarde de trabalho. Um grande abraço para você.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to be here, albeit on Zoom. I do hope to be able to come to Brazil one day in the body. But in the meantime, I enjoy meeting you all on Zoom, and thank you for inviting me to this Theasos to do this presentation. I've known about your group for a very long time, and the excellent work that you do. So I'm very pleased to be able to participate. So I'm going to share my screen and go through a presentation, which I've been told might, it won't last more than an hour. Hopefully, it will last less, and to leave plenty of time for discussion. You'll see on that I've put more text on the slides than I normally do, so that in case reading it is helpful to some of you, but I know that Isa is doing an excellent simultaneous translation anyway. So I'll share my screen now, and can I just confirm that you can see that okay? Is that yes, great, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk then about, well, the title of my talk is Breaking the Spell of Disenchantment, the Counter Magic of Individuation. I'll give a brief outline of the talk. Basically, I'm going to start by talking about what I've called the spell of disenchantment, and that will involve explaining a little bit about what is meant by the disenchantment of the world, about the epistemological implications of that view, that is, the implications for how we know things. And then I'll talk about some of the positive and the negative cultural and psychological implications of the view of disenchantment, and briefly how people, various intellectuals, have responded to the condition of disenchantment, what some of the main responses have been. Then in the second half of the talk, I'll talk about what I'm calling here the counter magic of individuation. And in this section, I'll talk about how Jung experienced this condition that has been described as disenchantment. I'll talk about how Jung's concept of individuation was, as it were, his response and, in a way, his remedy for the condition of disenchantment, how individuation helps in the undoing of disenchantment. Then I will look at a broader understanding of individuation in a way in which you can see individuation as being not just a way of undoing disenchantment or re-enchanting, but as a recursive process of enchantment, disenchantment, and re-enchantment. And I'll explain in due course what that means. And then I'll close by going back to the beginning, as it were, back to the figure of Max Weber, who coined the term disenchantment, and look at some unexpected affinities between his thought and Jung's. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the spell of disenchantment. So the idea of disenchantment, the disenchantment of the world, was is owed to the German social thinker, originative social thinker, and Max Weber, who was a sort of an older contemporary of Jung's. They never had any connection, as far as I know, no direct connection, but they overlapped significantly in their years of activity, although Max Weber died quite young in 1920. In 1917, 3 years before his death, Weber gave a lecture to a student society called Science as a Vocation, Wissenschaft als Beruf in German. And in this lecture, he discussed what he called the outer and inner conditions of academic life and the possibilities of obtaining knowledge. It was a lecture that was delivered or intended to be delivered to students who were thinking about having an academic career, and Weber was sort of letting them know what they would be letting themselves in for. And in the course of this lecture, he made this celebrated statement that the fate of our times, the fate of the modern world, the fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, he said, by the disenchantment of the world. That's the famous phrase, the disenchantment of the world. This word disenchantment, in German, Entzauberung, means more literally demagification, loss of magic, elimination of magic. And the idea is that it signifies the disappearance of magic from the world. So in the course of his lecture, Weber sort of mentions this term several times, and if one takes the lecture as a whole, you can extract from it certain implications for what we can know based on within this sort of worldview, as it were, of disenchantment, of loss of magic. So these epistemological implications of disenchantment have been clarified in particular by a writer, Egil Asprem, in a 2014 book called The Problem of Disenchantment. And he identified three main implications and a fourth one, which can be added. And the first one, which I like to summarize as being that in reality, according to the view of disenchantment, in reality, there is no genuine mystery. Asprem calls this epistemological optimism, the idea that nature can, in principle, be understood by empiricism and reason, that is, by science, that all the knowledge that we can reasonably get can be acquired by science. The second implication that Asprem extrapolates from Weber is that in reality there is no inherent meaning. Asprem calls this axiological skepticism. Axiological means it's got to do with the theory of value, and it's the idea that values cannot be derived from facts. Science can tell us the facts, can tell us what there is in the world, it can tell us how what there is in the world works and interacts and so on, but it can't tell us anything about values. And this can be sort of summarized as the idea or the view that science can know nothing of meaning. And Weber is quite explicit about this, that science can tell us nothing about meaning. There's no inherent meaning in the world that science can identify. It can give us no reason for believing there is such meaning. The third implication is that the world, the empirical world, is unrelated to any spiritual or divine reality. Asprem calls this metaphysical skepticism, the idea that science can know nothing beyond what is beyond the empirically given, beyond what is shown to us through our senses and reason, and therefore metaphysics, speculation about spirit and God and any realities beyond the empirical world, is impossible or futile. So this is the third implication. And if you take these three implications together, they imply that science and religion are irreconcilable. And this, for Weber, and as summarized by Asprem, means that you need to make what Weber calls an intellectual sacrifice in order to possess religion. If you want to believe in religion, you have to put aside everything that reason and empiricism, everything that science tells you. You can't reconcile religion and science, because empiricism and reason provide us with no evidence for the putative transcendent realities of religion. So this is in many ways, a very sort of bleak view. There's no genuine mystery, there's no inherent meaning, the world is unrelated to any spiritual or divine reality. Science and religion are irreconcilable. It's a world dominated, as it were, by an intellectual, scientifically oriented worldview. And this view also has implications culturally and psychologically. And some of these implications are positive. It's by no means entirely a negative picture. And in fact, there are very strong positive implications of this scientific view, as one might expect. I mean, the development of the kind of theoretical rationality that Weber thinks is the driving force behind disenchantment has resulted in science and technology, and all the benefits that stem from the development of science and technology, including the extraordinary advances in agriculture, in construction, in manufacturing, in transport and communication, and along with these, vastly improved economic conditions for many, many people, and the unprecedented availability of education and healthcare, and overall a tremendous enrichment of lifestyles. So there are all the benefits of science and technology that you can think of, in a sense, could be attributed or ascribed to this disenchanted worldview, which has made that the kind of thinking that has made all of this possible, this scientific, technological, disenchanted way of thinking. And not only are there these cultural implications, but there are also some beneficial psychological implications. For example, there is a greater differentiation, leads to a greater differentiation between self and others, and the world. So there's one feels more distinct from others, and this creates an enhanced sense of self-determination and agency, a greater sense of I-ness and agency, and that in turn leads to a greater sense of freedom inwardly, but also freedom from external social and political structures. So, and that feeling has informed a lot of the sort of Enlightenment thinking and the sort of the liberatory movements of the past several hundred years. So there's a lot that's very positive that has attended the development of this sort of disenchanted state of mind, this condition in which magic has, as it were, receded from the picture, and things have become much more intellectual, rational, and ultimately scientific. But there have also been negative, and these are some of the authors that you can find these ideas expressed in. But as well as these positive cultural and psychological implications, there have been negative cultural and psychological implications. And amongst those are, and this was highlighted by Max Weber himself, there has been a tremendous growth in bureaucratic social organizations. The same kind of technological thinking has resulted in a lot of social sort of management and control, and the proliferation of bureaucracy. It's resulted in instrumental thinking, the thinking of things in terms of what can you use them for, how can you exploit them, make use of them. And this in turn has led to kinds of relations which are very exploitative and sometimes even predatory, relations to other people at a political level, social level, and a political level, and to nature environmentally. The sense that nature is there as something outside of us that we can just use and exploit, and it doesn't really, we're not intimately connected with it. We don't feel any intimacy with it. Disenchantment has also led to an overall sense, or a loss of the sense, of the sacred, and of life as sacred, and of reality as being in some sense objectively symbolic. That is, that reality, that what we experience, what we perceive empirically about reality, in some way reflects a deeper, more meaningful reality, that it symbolizes something, it expresses something. And it has also led to a loss of a shared grounding for values. In the time before disenchantment, so the narrative goes, there was a sort of, we had sort of a shared sense of what values were grounded in usually in some sort of sense of the sacred. With the loss of that, values become things that one chooses or prefers, and there's no way of grounding them objectively. And again, there are psychological implications. more negative psychological implications this time. Part of this is the excessive one-sided rationalism which comes to dominate the ways in which culture is sort of organized, and the way in which we think, the dominance we give to rationality as opposed to emotions and so on. A tremendous division between oneself, a sense of a division between oneself and others, and oneself and the world, a sense of being separate from others, and to the point where both others and the world seem to be objects, often sort of devoid of any real life and value, and we ourselves sometimes come to experience ourselves as objects, and this is sort of leads to an overall sense of meaninglessness and alienation, and along with that come various mental health problems of neuroses, psychoses, and so on, and addictions, and so on, and the various cultural distractions that proliferate in order to take one's mind off these problems. So there are also very powerful negative consequences of disenchantment, and they often get accentuated in the literature. And again, you can find these same sort of negative implications also noted by many of the same authors who see this sort of this ambivalent nature of disenchantment. It's positive, but also its negative aspects. Why did I call this talk The Spell of Disenchantment, or Breaking the Spell of Disenchantment? I mean, an enchantment is a spell. So disenchantment is supposed to be the breaking of the spell. So why is the breaking of the spell itself a spell? And the reason I say that is because the discourse, or the story, as it were, of disenchantment, the narrative of disenchantment, has itself come to grip our culture, so that it seems to be the dominant story, if you like. And one way one can understand this is through the work of or some ideas that were articulated by the Canadian social thinker and philosopher Charles Taylor in his book In a Secular Age, in which he talks about what he calls subtraction stories. And subtraction stories are where you tell a narrative, or it's the idea that that there is a problem and you remove that problem, and what is left is then the reality. And in relation to disenchantment, the idea is, as Taylor puts it here, that what we got rid of in transitioning to the modern disenchanted world of what Taylor calls closed immanence were the illusions. And it took courage to do this, to get rid of these illusions of religion. What is left are the genuine deliverances of science, the truth about things, including ourselves, which was waiting all along to be discovered. So the idea is that the truth, that we were formerly living in an illusion, believing in religion, believing in magic, science and rationality came along and stripped us of those illusions. They took them away, subtracted them, and then what's left over, the bleak world of sort of living in a meaningless universe with no mystery and no relation to anything spiritual or metaphysical. This is just the reality that is left over, and this kind of story is deeply embedded in modern humanist consciousness, Taylor said, and this is why I call it a spell. It's got society, culture in its grip, so that we tend to believe this almost as second nature, implicitly, if not explicitly, in our actions, in the kind of education we promulgate, and so on. And Taylor himself accounts for this attractiveness, as it were, by pointing out that some epistemological reasons for it being attractive, that we tend to prioritize in our culture some things over others. The self is considered to be prior to the external world. You know, the in here is more important than the out there. Facts are more important than values, or prior to values. We think about what can be proven scientifically before we attach any importance to the value of anything. The natural is given priority over the transcendent. So we have these priority relations for which Taylor argues there are no actually, you know, indisputable philosophical reasons why one of these would be prior, have this right relationship of priority rather than the opposite. And then there is in addition to the epistemological attractiveness of disenchantment, there is the moral attractiveness of it. Weber refers, Taylor refers to the heroic, the experience of the heroic manliness of facing up to a stark universe without God. There's a sort of sense of, you know, I'm up to this. I'm brave enough and I'm man enough. And Weber uses this term, as we'll see. I'm man enough to accept that there is no God in the universe, that it's a bleak and meaningless universe. I can stoically accept this harsh reality. So there's a sort of a moral attraction there, strangely enough. So how have people responded to disenchantment, to this condition? Well, unsurprisingly, there has been a variety of kinds of response. For Weber himself, he did acknowledge the positive economic benefits and cultural benefits and so on, but he was also very aware of the negative and how disenchantment, as he put it, encases us in the iron cage of bureaucracy. It's a famous phrase of his, the iron cage of bureaucracy. It turns us each into what he calls a single cog in an ever-moving mechanism. And it leads us towards, he says, a polar night of icy darkness and hardness. So it leads us into this sort of very bleak reality. And as I was just saying, Weber himself advocates that we learn how to bear the fate of the times like a man, that we just accept this is the way things are, this is the condition, this is the way things are in the modern world, and we just have to learn to bear it like a man, he said. So this is Weber's response in his essay on, principally in his essay on science as a vocation, but also in several other works that I've cited that. Other people have had different responses to disenchantment. Some authors, Hans Blumenberg, the Jungian Wolfgang Gigerich, seem to have taken a much more positive view of disenchantment and see it as being you know, like Weber, as being the fate of our times, but seeing this as a more positive thing, that when you know the benefits that it's led to are something to be celebrated. This is like the greater maturity of the human being and so on, growing up. Others again have denied or have seen that there is disenchantment, or have seriously qualified disenchantment for the reason that they still find plenty of enchantment around. You know, that enchantment never vanished, and there are a variety of writers who take this view, either that it's still possible to have enchantment, or that even among the people who are sort of advocates of disenchantment, you can still find that they are implicitly interested and captivated by mysteries and enchanted phenomena. So some people take that view, and then there is quite a large number of people who have countered the narrative of disenchantment by offering narratives of what has been called re-enchantment. So if the world has lost its magic, people, some authors have tried to find ways in which one can restore the magic, bring the magic back to the world, and have developed these narratives of re-enchantment. And some of those narratives involve references to the sacred, but many of them, again, are purely secular, and they're ideas that in the modern world we can bring magic back without necessarily that being a religious form of magic or a transcendent form of magic. That there are forms of enchantment that are, as it were, more immanent. And in general, re-enchantment or strategies of re-enchantment attempt to foster more holistic, or so the argument goes, attempt to foster more holistic, interconnected, cooperative, and ultimately meaningful relations among people and between people and nature. So they try to undo or to challenge or to offer something different from those negative relationships that we noted earlier, the relationships of exploitation and predation. So those are the sort of broad range of responses to disenchantment, and I'm now going to bring in our main person, Carl Jung, and he is interested, or his approach, his response, as it were, is I'm going to argue is in the last category, mainly that he is offering a way of challenging disenchantment, of re-enchanting. He is offering, in the phrase that I'm using, a form of counter magic to disenchantment, what I've called the counter magic of individuation. So Jung himself never used the word disenchantment or Entzauberung, as far as I'm aware. I've never seen him use the word, but he did talk in not dissimilar terms about what he called the historical process of world despiritualization. That's in his psychology and religion lectures. And in an interview with Mircea Eliade, towards the end of his life, he spoke about how the modern world is desacralized. That, he says, is why it is in a crisis. So he has had a view, this is in his mature work, had a view that is very similar to Weber's work, even though he's using despiritualization and desacralization rather than disenchantment as his terminology. And this was sort of based also on a similar sort of appreciation or recognition of what he called the problem of one-sided scientific rationalism. Weber associated disenchantment with intellectualization and rationalization, and so too does Jung. He sees the one-sided scientific rationalism as resulting in these problems of despiritualization and desacralization. And this is something that Jung experienced right from early on in his life, biographically, professionally, and at all levels. So, I mean, very early on, he experienced his father's religious collapse because his father thought that his father was a Protestant pastor, but Jung thought that his father had this sort of religious collapse because he no longer really believed in the religion in which he had faith. He had no experience of it. He had been confronted, as it were, by the findings of science, and he sort of felt that religious experience, what he was calling the soul in his professional work, was really just activity in the brain and so on. So he tried to maintain his faith, but he didn't really believe it, and this led to this religious collapse. So this rationalism had sort of really impacted his father, and Jung experienced that quite profoundly. And then in his early work, his early professional work, you can see that it is shot through. Everywhere in it, you can find a tension between disenchanting science and a sort of enchanting spirituality. If you read Jung's student lectures, his Zavingia lectures, you find this theme very commonly present. If you read Jung's doctoral dissertation on the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomena, you've got a very enchanted phenomenon, the spiritual mediums and the possession by spirits and channeling spirits and communicating with the dead and so on is the ostensible topic. But Jung is approaching it in a very rational way, a very scientific way in his dissertation. So there's this tension between the science and the spirituality. And then there's his involvement with psychoanalysis, his early work at the Begurzli, where he's using very scientific methods of word associations tests and psychogalvanometric tests and so on to investigate very irrational phenomena. So again, very mysterious, unknown phenomena, but he's trying to apply disenchanted techniques of science to understand it. And similarly with his involvement in psychoanalysis, this was again penetrating into the world of the unconscious, this highly irrational, mysterious world, but trying to approach it from a disenchanted perspective. But within all of this attempt to approach these things in a disenchanted way, Jung also had the experience that there was something that was not being addressed. And this sort of gradually built up in him, I think, and eventually found expression in the experiences that he writes about in Liber Novus, his Red Book, whose overall theme, as Sonu Shamdasani puts it in his introduction, is how Jung regains his soul and overcomes the contemporary malaise of spiritual alienation, which in a sense is just another way of talking about disenchantment. So this is, so this became the theme, really. I mean, of Jung's Red Book is how to get out of disenchantment. And it's very interesting that Jung was working on that exactly at the time when Weber was sort of formulating his ideas about disenchantment. Jung was experiencing something very similar, but was taking the approach of trying to escape it, trying to undo it, or trying to, as I've put it in the title of this talk, try to break its spell. And throughout his sort of professional work, not just his more theoretical and scholarly work, but his therapeutic work, also continually encountered the phenomenon of disenchantment. Some of the patients about which he writes most frequently are classic instances of people who are suffering from this hyper-rationalization, hyper-rational consciousness that is fostered by the disenchanted worldview. So Maggie Reichstein, whom Vicente de Moura writes about, the patients who had the experience with the scarab beetle in Jung's famous example, was this sort of overly rational person. Wolfgang Pauli, whom he writes about in Psychology and Alchemy and Psychology and Religion, was another highly rational individual whose problems were stemmed precisely from the extent to which they were over-identified with that outlook. So Jung had a very profound, lifelong experience of disenchantment, personally, professionally, in relation through his patients and so on. He was deeply immersed in this problem. And I think one can see in his work, the work that emerged out of his own inquiries in his Red Book experiment and beyond, how he attempts to develop a system of thought that's part of which specifically undoes the disenchantment, the worldview of disenchantment. So this is what I mean by individuation as counter magic. Individuation is Jung's way of undoing disenchantment. And so individuation, of course, is Jung's theory of a process of how one becomes a unique self through the ongoing synthesis of consciousness and the unconscious, and how this involves, obviously, first of all, developing a secure ego, but then recognizing the insufficiency of one-sided ego development, and often after a sort of personal crisis, then beginning to engage with the unconscious and its archetypes, reconnecting with the unconscious, with archetypes such as, in particular, Jung writes about the shadow, the anima animus, and ultimately this process leads to the realization of psychological wholeness, or the experience of the self, which Jung describes as the archetype of wholeness. So individuation, this whole process, I think, is in a way Jung's response to the problem represented by the condition of disenchantment in the culture. And I'll show some of how I think individuation, as it were, undoes disenchantment or breaks the spell of disenchantment. So where disenchantment implies that the world is lacking in any genuine mystery, individuation, Jung's process of individuation, precisely affirms that there is genuine mystery, that there are mysterious, incalculable forces, which Weber says disenchantment suggests there are not. And these mysterious, incalculable forces for Jung are, expressed by the very concepts that he uses, the concept of the unconscious. It's inherently mysterious, it's unknown, it's in many respects unknowable. The symbol his way of understanding the symbol is always inherently, partly unknown. The archetype as such, as opposed to the archetypal image, the archetype as such is, again, inherently unknowable. The central archetype in Jung's thinking, the self, is presented as paradoxical at its highest realizations, as fundamentally paradoxical, something intellectually you just cannot grasp it. It just presents itself to you as a paradox. Whatever you think you can say about it is sort of undone by something that seems to be equally true from another side. And he also develops the concept of synchronicity, which is precisely a concept that aims at trying to express and articulate the reality of mysterious phenomena. So Jung's work, contrary to the disenchanted view, affirms the reality of genuine mystery. Again, it affirms the reality of inherent meaning, that there is inherent meaning in the world, that meaning is not just something that we, as human beings, subjectively project onto the world, that the world itself is sort of empty of meaning, is just a sort of a meaningless mechanism, and we project meaning onto it to make ourselves feel more at home in the universe. For Jung, meaning was an inherent part of reality. The archetypes, which he says, which are the sort of founding structures of the way we experience the world psychologically, but also in his later thinking, after he's developed the idea of the psychoid archetype, the archetype as structuring not just the psyche, but also the physical world. The archetypes provide a core of meaning that structures the psyche and the physical world. So the world itself, at its deep structure, it has these factors, these archetypes that articulate a core of meaning. Jung describes his central archetype, the archetype of the self, as the archetype of orientation and meaning. So this is actually the archetype of meaning, the self. And meaning, in his essay on synchronicity, he has a whole chapter trying to grapple with this idea that meaning, which in synchronicity is the connecting factor between the events that are coinciding. Jung tries to express the view that this meaning is objective. He calls it self-subsistent, a priori. He calls it transcendental. It's meaning that is presented as not just a subjective meaning, but as in some sense objective, as being a real feature of reality. And this is again deeply challenging to the worldview of disenchantment. And we saw that the disenchanted worldview also denies that there can be any relationship to spiritual, divine or metaphysical reality. But Jung, again, seems to affirm the possibility of such relationship. He talks about, he effectively, in several places, equates God and the unconscious, so that the divine expresses itself through the unconscious for Jung. He talks about how images of God that appear in dreams or in cultural expressions are indistinguishable from images of the self. And he refers to the archetypes as being numinous. This is a very important quality of the archetypes, that they are numinous, that is inherently spiritual, expressive of this non-rational aspect of the holy, in Rudolf Otto's terms. He refers to individuation as a religious or spiritual process, and he even uses the expression that individuation is the life in God. So for Jung, there is quite a strong affirmation that there can be a relationship to spiritual and metaphysical reality. Of course, he has his own doubt, his own questions about doing metaphysics, and he wants to seem to be an empiricist and so on. But he clearly expresses the idea that there can be this relationship. So in these ways, amongst others, this is a sort of snapshot, really. Jung challenges the very idea of disenchantment. With this, specifically through his notion of individuation. And what I want to do very quickly, and I'm not going to spend very much time on this, but we can maybe talk about it more in the discussion if people are interested, is to suggest that one of the interesting features of Jung's model in proposing this sort of challenge to disenchantment, this as one might want to call it, this re-enchantment, is that that Jung is not proposing re-enchantment as a way of obliterating disenchantment, or even obliterating the sort of more naive enchantment that precedes disenchantment, but that actually individuation can be seen as a recursive process that includes phases or stages of enchantment, disenchantment, and re-enchantment. And I think one can see this in two ways. One can see it through looking at Jung's ways in which Jung's psychotherapeutic model has been summarized by various thinkers. I'm drawing on a version by Murray Stein, which in turn is based on Erich Neumann's work. Here we're looking at individuation considered across the lifespan. In this kind of way of looking, there is, first of all, in childhood, there is this maternal stage of individuation where there is the experience of containment and nurturance. And this seems to me to be a state that is very similar to the state of enchantment, when everything is sort of magically happens or magically is given to you, and one's looked after, and everything is kind of full of wonder and freshness and newness. It is a very enchanted sort of state. But then one sort of grows out of that. One has to grow out of that as one enters the paternal stage, more associated with early adulthood, when one has to adapt and adjust to reality, and to sort of remove some of the more conspicuous of one's projections and so on, to relate to the real world. And this is, in some sense, a sort of a disenchanting phase of development. And these two phases together, if you like, constitute the sort of first half of life, as Jung sometimes talked about it. And then the third stage in this model, or this way of looking, is the so-called individual stage, which is concerned with centering, integrating, the sort of more fully individuating phase, if you like, associated with mature adulthood. And this is what could be associated more with the specific work of re-enchantment, of a rediscovery of a certain magic that had been lost as one adapted to a social and world and outer reality and its demands. So you can see certain correlations between enchantment, disenchantment, re-enchantment, and this model of psychological development based on Jung's concept of individuation across the lifespan. But we can also see it, and in more detail, if you look at Jung's later way of talking about individuation through alchemy, particularly in Mysterium Conjunctionis, where he culminates that work, which is in a sense a description, an account in alchemical imagery of the process of individuation. He culminates it with a discussion of the work of Gerard Dorn and his conjunctions, 3 conjunctions, and in this sort of model that's presented, Dorn talks about, or Jung extracts from Dorn, this idea that there is this state of the natural union of the mind with the body, a sort of mixing of the mind with the body, which is the natural state. Jung refers to it as a half animal state, actually. This is the natural state of natural union, and this is, the state of like a state of enchantment, of participation mystique, as Jung also liked to say. And the work of specifically of individuation is where one unites the mind with spirit, uses the spiritual values to sort of free the mind from its entrammelment, its entanglement with the body, to create an inner unity, what Dorn calls an unio mentalis. And this is like a kind of disenchantment. On the one hand, it's a very profound spiritual attainment, but he calls it a disenchantment because it disconnects one from, disconnects the soul or the mind from the body and unites it with the spirit, with the values, with a mental and intellectual world, and results in this experience of sort of inner integrity, but a sense of detachment and disengagement from the world and the body. So the next phase is where the union of the united mind spirit with the body and its world takes place, and Dorn calls this the Kailum, the heaven, or the heaven on earth, the creation of the heaven on earth. And this is the phase that I think could be equated with re-enchantment, where one rediscovers how the world and the body can be animated again, can come to life again. The world which had been in the development of a spiritual unity or spiritual center had become, as it were, bereft of vitality, becomes filled with vitality again. And And then there is a stage, a further stage, which is not present in the psychotherapeutic model in Mysterium Conjunctionis, which is that there is this sort of union of the united body, mind, spirit with the unus mundus, or the one world, as Jung calls it, the world of potential. And this union, Dawn refers to as the unio mystica, the mystical union. And how one would characterize that, obviously, is itself quite mysterious. What does this mean, the united body, mind, spirit uniting with the world of potential? What would that be like? And one way of thinking about it, I think, is that it would be a state of spontaneous creativity. This is the world of potential that one's united with. It would be a state of spontaneous creativity. And what would be created would be new realities. And those new realities, in a sense, would initially be experienced in an enchanted kind of way. There would be an initial identification with them, an initial non-differentiation from them. They'd be sort of, and so they'd be, so there'd be new enchanted realities coming into being, and that would, as it were, set the whole process off again in another level, or another level of the spiral, if you like. So this is why I've referred to the process that's being implicitly described here as recursive. That as you go through this process, it generates new realities, to which the whole process needs to, as it were, occur again. So anyway, this is just a sort of a suggestion of what you can extrapolate from some of Jung's work on disenchantment, work on individuation. But it does have some interesting implications for how one thinks about disenchantment, or how people have thought about disenchantment. I won't dwell on these, I'll just sort of mention them, but if one was interested in disenchantment, there are some problems in the literature that I think this can help us to clarify. One thing is why is there this grip or spell of disenchantment? Why is it such a powerful narrative? And part of the reason for that is that disenchantment for Jung is not just a sort of an error of hyper-rationalization and so on, but it's also part of an archetypal process. It has its role, and as such will have its own deep archetypal fascination, reinforced, of course, by the fact that it is supported by current cultural values. The ambivalence of disenchantment, the fact that, as we saw, that on the one hand there are these tremendous benefits, and there's people who celebrate it, disenchantment as a positive thing, and then there are the negative consequences which lead others to sort of want to flee disenchantment and to find some kind of re-enchantment. How can this be understood? Well, if we've got the process of enchantment, disenchantment, re-enchantment as a sort of developmental process, then disenchantment stands beyond naive enchantment. So we're liberated, it represents a liberation from enchantment. But in relation to re-enchantment, it's a sort of an obstruction, or a state that is, if we identify with, if we become related on, enters from realizing the potentialities of late stage individuation or re-enchantment. And so there are reasons for being both positive and negative about it. People have pointed out that enchantment persists. From Jung's point of view, this would be totally expected, partly because enchantment is itself part of a natural process. And if it's a recurrent process or a recursive process, then there will always be enchantments coming into being. But also because even when one does the work of disenchantment, if that work is only half done or is only partially done, enchantments will continue to exist in the unconscious. As Jung sort of points out, you can get rid of the demons externally, but then they remain in the unconscious and take on different forms of diseases or of ideologies or whatever it might be. The emergence of attempts at re-enchantment, the cultural phenomenon of that, where do they come from? from Jung's point of view, that would be again parts of a natural process. In the natural process of development, at a certain point, there comes this need to go beyond the disenchanting phase. So these alternative narratives would kind of suggest themselves from the unconscious and would need to be articulated in some way and then lived. Very often, well, from the perspective of Jung's model, you can understand how naive enchantment, that is enchantment from which one has not been disenchanted, can sometimes be confused with re-enchantment, which is a state that is a state one might achieve after one has been disenchanted and gone beyond disenchantment. And the difference is that whereas re-enchantment or individuation in its late stages is a very arduous, dangerous and difficult process, enchantment, naive enchantment, just sort of, you know, it can be a very comfortable, comforting, easy process to just relapse back into, to get away from the hard business of facing reality and just descending back into a fantasy world. So criticisms of attempts at re-enchantment are often, I think, mistargeted in the sense that what they're really criticizing is the reversion into naive enchantment rather than the real work, the really difficult and dangerous work of re-enchantment or genuine late stage individuation. This model can also help one to understand, in a certain sense, attempts at secular re-enchantment. That because for Jung, disenchantment is a precondition for re-enchantment, and when re-enchantment takes place, disenchantment remains active within it. As one engages in individuation, you don't cease to need to be able to break withdraw your projections and to be critical about your psychological experience. You need it all the more as you sort of go into these sort of deeper sort of processes. So disenchantment and the need for disenchantment is perennial for Jung, and therefore, you know, the continual presence of this sort of disenchantment this need for disenchantment can give a certain attractiveness to that sort of critical consciousness, and can lend a sort of attractiveness to these secular attempts at re-enchantment. I mean, Jung, I think you can even see Jung's work as being as offering in some way a dual secular and religious perspective. Jung is equally interested in both and tries to steer a path that respects both of these approaches, and I think that can help us to understand why some people attempt to find secular modes of re-enchantment. Re-enchantment is often associated with holism, and this is understandable from Jung's framework in terms of how individuation culminates in realization of the self, which of course is the archetype of wholeness. It's this experience of wholeness. So this would make total sense that re-enchantment was associated with holism from Jung's point of view. And then finally, and surprisingly, mystical experience is sometimes, well, offered as a way out of disenchantment. And this, in the light of Jung's sort of work in Mysterium Conjunctionis, can be understood because for Jung, mystical experience there, the unio mystica, the mystical union, is the culmination of individuation. But as I suggested, it at the same time creatively generates new enchantment. So it's not a once and for all final escape into a static reality of stillness or anything. It's a creative dynamism which generates further process. I'll just conclude by saying a little bit about Jung and Weber and a strange, unexpected point of convergence in this idea of mystical union. Some recent work on Weber by Jason Josephson Storm in a book called The Myth of Disenchantment has suggested that Weber intimated that mystical union, unio mystica, could provide a way out of disenchantment. But Weber himself seems not to have believed in its present possibility. Now this, what Josephson Storm shows is that Weber had an intense interest in mysticism. He studied Asian religions, Indian and Chinese religions, in particular for their mystical, and noted their mystical aspects. He was knowledgeable about Western mystics. He associated with contemporary mystics, such as the poet Stefan George and the philosopher Ludwig Klages. And he also, it's been suggested, in particular by Weber's biographer Joachim Radkau, that he had personal mystical experience. So Weber was deeply interested in mysticism. He not only was interested in it, but he evaluated it very positively. He referred to mysticism as the pinnacle of religious experience. He thought it was still a living possibility. He came to that view. He referred to it as the last means of accessing the transcendent God that had been expelled by reason. So he didn't believe in religion and religious practice so much, but the possibility of individual mystical experience he did believe in. And not only did he believe in its possibility, but he thought it was actually having such experience was a condition for wholesome being, that without it, we were sort of not complete as human beings. And this is very similar to what Jung is saying in a way. He characterized mysticism. These are just hints and clues that you can find, or that Josephson Storm found in Weber's work. He sees mysticism as a counterweight to the rationalization that is associated with disenchantment. It's aligned, mysticism is aligned with charisma and authentic prophecy against alienation, bureaucracy, routinization, and intellectual hyper-specialization. And Weber even suggests that mysticism might be compatible with empiricism. These are all things that seem to be very different from what he says in Science as a Vocation, but you can find these clues in his work, that there's this ambivalence in Weber, and he also expresses this other side. And he, as I said, he even suggests that mysticism might be seen as a way out of disenchantment, that it's part of what he sort of seems to hint at as being a higher order synthesis of disenchantment and enchantment that would constitute a new prophecy or religion. And again, this is pretty much what you could argue Jung offers. Whether Jung wants to call it a new prophecy or religion, some people have, or not. And Jung's Red Book is presented as a prophecy in many ways. Starts off with long quotations from prophets and sort of hinting the way Jung might want it to be looked at in itself. But this is what Weber says, and again it seems to tally to fit with what Jung is saying. So, in conclusion, Jung's process of individuation seems to provide exactly what Weber envisaged. That is, a way out of disenchantment that is grounded in a form of mysticism, if you like, realization of the self, the culmination of individuation, realization of the archetype of wholeness, most fully in this experience of the unio mystica. And if one sort of sees Jung's work in that light, then this provides for the possibility of envisaging a form of Jungian psychosocial studies, which is, as it were, re-enchanted. That is a form of Jungian psychosocial studies which takes account of genuine mystery, inherent meaning, and possible relationship to trans-empirical or spiritual realities. a form of psychosocial studies that presupposes that human agents, and in some sense possibly also social systems, are in this sort of unified view deeply interconnected, and in some way or other are transforming towards a kind of greater unity or self-realization. So those are just sort of hints, but I think you know, probably quite scandalously, I think you can find these in Jung, and quite unexpectedly find these affinities with Weber, as though Weber was hinting at a possibility that is taken forward or articulated in Jung. And this may provide a way, an interesting convergence, point of convergence for thinking about their work together. So I'm going to stop there, and I realise that's been quite a lot of material. So I look forward to questions about it. Thank you very much for listening.
Obrigado, Roderick, pela tua apresentação, uma apresentação densa, né, rigorosa, que levanta uma série de questões contemporâneas, eu diria, importantes a serem debatidas. Bom, vamos lá. Vamos abrir o debate. Quem quiser fazer perguntas, por favor, nome no chat, eu chamo e a pessoa faz a pergunta. Roderick, eu queria começar com duas questões. A minha primeira pergunta seria pensar, a partir de tudo que você disse, é possível pensar que a psicologia junguiana ou a teoria junguiana é uma resposta à crise da modernidade? A gente poderia nomeá-la como uma resposta à crise que a modernidade nos coloca? Essa é uma primeira pergunta que eu te colocaria. E uma segunda, para além das questões e dos processos históricos, econômicos, sociais, a experiência de encantamento e desencantamento podem também ser pensadas como fantasias arquetípicas. Quer dizer, é possível também pensá-las não como decorrências de mudanças histórico-sociais, mas também como padrões arquetípicos. Queria começar a nossa conversa por aí.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for those questions, which are both excellent questions, which really go to the heart of what I've been trying to talk about, I think. And in response to the first question, whether one can see Jungian psychology, in a sense, as a response to the condition of modernity and the crises of modernity, I think, I mean, my own view is that that is exactly what it is. That in a way, I mean, you know, Jung, if one thinks of the genesis of Jung's thought, you know, in his, if one were to say that, you know, to see the genesis of his distinctive psychological contribution as being the sort of theory of individuation, the process of individuation, and what emerged from his encounter with his unconscious in his Red Book experience. When he entered that experience, he said that this was at the, you know, when the First World War broke out, and he said that, you know, he suspected that his fantasies were a personal problem, and that, you know, the sign of an incipient psychosis or something. But then when the First World War broke out, he took the view that, in fact, what was happening to him was a reflection of what was happening outwardly. And therefore, he says, he entered into and deepened his inquiry into himself, because he felt that this was an inquiry into what was going on in the collective psyche, or in the spirit of the age, if you like. So I think he saw the project that he was engaged in as precisely grappling with, you know, the dilemmas and problems of the age. He saw, in a sense, you know, he came to articulate this in sort of almost esoteric terms later, when he talked about, you know, when he talked about microcosm and macrocosm. But I think he saw the human psyche as a sort of microcosm of the macrocosm of the social world and the global situation and so on. And in working on the psyche, I think he thought he was attending to the social and cultural problems, and that the social and cultural problems, as it were, express themselves. One of the ways, not the only way, obviously, but one of the ways in which they express themselves was in the structures of the individual's psyche and the fantasies that individuals have and so on. So I think his process that he developed of healing the mind and the psyches of individuals was also for him a healing of society and of culture. You know, it's not, by no means the only route to such work, but for him, I think it was one. And I think the urgency that he felt for developing his work was because he saw it as being not just about this or that individual and so on, but about our collective situation. So yeah, I mean, personally, I do think it was very much about a response to modernity, and that's really what, in my own work, I kind of argue all along. Regarding the second point, that whether this sort of process, if you like, of the relationship between enchantment, disenchantment, re-enchantment could be viewed not just as a sort of historical socio-cultural process, but also as an archetypal fantasy. That I think that's right. I think it can be. I mean, and that does, of course, raise questions about what is the relationship between those two things. How do the fantasies relate to the external processes? And you know, I don't myself see any reason why it can't be both. You know, because I think you could see the process of enchantment, disenchantment and re-enchantment, not just on this sort of grand scale of cultural and social processes, and even not just on the sort of the individual scale of the lifespan of an individual or the individuation journey of an individual, but you could see it in relation to more individual events. You know, for example, you could see a particular relationship as having an enchanted, disenchanted and re-enchanted stage, if you like. I mean, I think Jung himself writes about his own relationship to his wife in those terms. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, you know, he talks about how, you know, that after he'd had his sort of vision of his wife after she died, and he says he had this sort of objective experience of her as though she'd been individuated. And he talks about it being a form of objective cognition beyond the emotional ties of ordinary relationship. I think he's there talking about a re-enchanted phase of relationship, which is beyond one, where, you know, when one initially falls in love with someone or establishes a relationship with someone, there's a lot of that is based on projection and sort of, you know, projection of fantasies and so on. And part of in the course of the relationship, many of those get dissolved, and there are disenchanting phases or disenchanted phases in many relationships. But then beyond the disenchanted phases, there is the possibility, I think Jung is saying, of a sort of a deeper form of connection, which is something which he calls creates the possibility of the real conjunction, the true conjunction, which is this other phase. So I think you could see, you know, that sort of fantasy, if you like, of enchantment, disenchantment, re-enchantment, operating at the level of a relationship. Or you could even see it maybe in a sort of even smaller sense in relation to the interpretation of a dream. You know, when one has a dream, initially that dream is like it's an enchanting phenomenon. It's there. It's attractive. It fascinates. It's alluring. What is it? It's a dream. You don't know quite. Then you take a critical stance towards it. You interpret it. You get some critical distance from it and understand it and turn it this way, turn it that way. You get a sort of an intellectual interpretation of it, if you like, or not just an intellectual interpretation, but an interpretation of it. And that, in a sense, is a disenchanting of the dream. It's putting it in some sort of more comprehensible context in relation to your life. But then once one's done that, the dream can become re-enchanted again when it becomes lived in one's life, when the dream suddenly sort of reanimates and sort of expresses itself. It could be through, you know, synchronistic events in one's actual life. You see the reality of the dream, as it were, the structure or whatever it was that was present in that dream, enacting itself in the world beyond just one's psyche. I mean, that might be a part of the re-enchanting phase. But even without that, the dream can then reactivate, in a sense, work recursively and sort of reactivate one's psyche. It has works back on one's psyche and then generates new enchantments, new dreams, affects, you know, one's psychic process. So I mean, those are just sort of tentative suggestions, but you know, these are some of the ways in which I try and think about this as a, you know, an archetypal process that could be can be applied beyond socio-cultural processes, beyond even just the individuation process as a whole, if you like.
Ele pode encontrar vários territórios possíveis, né, para se exercer.
I would think so. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Obrigado, Roderick. Vamos lá. Então, Luciana Ximenes. Lu.
Roderick, obrigada pela sua belíssima palestra. Eu fiquei pensando, né, agora que vocês falaram sobre essas várias possibilidades desse encantamento, desencantamento e reencantamento, que não é necessariamente um processo, né, como Neumann coloca, né, como um processo linear. Eu acho que é um processo circular que pode acontecer, pelo que eu entendi, né, várias vezes na vida, até por dia, imagino eu. E aí eu fiquei pensando, eu sou uma grande leitora do Hillman, né, e eu fiquei pensando do jeito que o Hillman usa individuação, ele usa individuações, né, ele não usa um processo de individuação, e ele mal usa o conceito de self. E aí a minha pergunta para você é se você acha que a gente pode usar essa sua ideia do reencantamento sem necessariamente usar o conceito de self.
I mean, I think I agree about this idea of that you know, the enchantment, disenchantment, re-enchantment as a sort of process, not necessarily being a linear process, but being cyclical or spiral or even more complex than that. You know, the way I would envisage it is that that all these processes or all these aspects or phases of process are sort of coexistent in relation to different facets of one's being and sort of you know, so at any moment, any person can be enchanted in some ways, disenchanted in other ways, and re-enchanted in other ways, as it were, in a complex way. So I certainly think that's possible. And this idea of individuations in the plural that's also, I think, quite credible to me. I wouldn't, one could, if one wants to sort of dispense with the idea of the self, that's fine. I think to a large extent, as Hillman has shown, a lot of this, these concepts still work or still have a lot important work to do, and very importantly, I myself am not so troubled by the concept of the self, because I think the concept of the self in a way is not as pernicious as Hillman thought it was, or sometimes writes as though it might be. This is my view. That I think that there's this sort of sense of the concept of the self as being a sort of disguised version of a sort of monotheistic, sort of theistic outlook, with all the problems that can entail in terms of the sort of domination of one viewpoint, subsuming all other viewpoints, and asserting its superior value over them, and so on. And how that can sort of inscribe certain kinds of hierarchical relationships and totalitarian relationships even. But I have to say, this is, to bring a little bit of theology in. I think there are different ways of understanding monotheism, and I would distinguish between two importantly different ways. One is the sort of monotheism. This is work that one finds in some authors in this area. One of them is an Egyptologist called Jan Assmann, who distinguished between what he called biblical monotheism and evolutionary monotheism. Biblical monotheism he associated with Judeo-Christian religions, and it was the idea that the idea of a one God is asserted over against all other gods, and it's thou shalt have no other gods. And there's this sort of the divine, the God is in some way ontologically, fundamentally different from, separate than, superior to nature and everything else, and all these other gods are really just nature. They're something than which God is completely different, ontologically different. And that's one kind of monotheism that gets transmitted through the Judeo-Christian traditions, and the Islamic traditions gets perpetuated deeply into Western culture. The other kind of monotheism that Assmann talks about, which he calls evolutionary monotheism, is a monotheism that says that in which it's not a case of one God and thou shalt have no other gods, but it's one God who is also the of which all of the gods are part, if you like. So it's a kind of all the other gods are parts of the one God, as it were. So it's like in the Hindu tradition, you get this idea, and Assmann himself was thinking of the Egyptian tradition, where all the many gods are parts of the one God. So there isn't this ontological separation between what that polytheism represented and the one God. The polytheism and the monotheism are the same thing, just expressed in different ways, if you like. And that tradition, which gets rather marginalized in the Western tradition, I think is the one that has its own trajectory through Western culture and into Western culture through mainly esoteric currents of thought. the kind of currents of thought that Hillman himself was quite fond of, actually. So I think, you know, and the interaction between those two, the evolutionary monotheism and the biblical monotheism, you know, accounts for, can account for a lot of the sort of attempts that were made to integrate more esoteric thought with Christian thought in, for example, the Renaissance, with people like Marsilio Ficino and others, and the, you know, and also sort of, I think one can find those tensions deeply within Jung's thought, who was kind of like half a pagan, half a Christian, if you know what I mean. So he was sort of he was feeling the tension between those two different views, and I think in relation to disenchantment as a process, and indeed individuation as a re-enchanting process, I think from Jung's point of view, you can see the more sort of evolutionary monotheism, the more esoteric current, as being quite important in the way he thinks about these things, because for Jung, in my view, unlike in the sort of biblical monotheistic tradition, where God doesn't need the world, God is separate from the world, essentially separate from the world, doesn't need the world. In the more evolutionary monotheism, which you could characterize as panentheistic, if you like, the divine is not separate from the world, but is actually expressed in and through the world, and the world, and also the divine, in a sense, needs the world, and is sort of transforming in some way on one level with the world. So you get this sort of idea of an evolving God, if you like, which is, a sort of idea that one encounters in Jung, or at least an evolving aspect of the divine. So I mean, that's rather. I apologise for that rather heavy theological response, but that's kind of how I, would try and sort of think about these things. So that for me, the idea of the self, as Jung articulates it, is a concept that is not. It's not like the sort of biblical monotheistic unitary center. It's a more esoteric kind of divine, which incorporates plurality, implies plurality, and in its realization, it's not a static, up and out escape from reality. It's a dynamic center that is generating creativity within, at the core of life. I mean, is how I would see it. So, I mean.
Ótimo, obrigada.
Obrigado, Lu. Roderick, Joel quer fazer uma pergunta. Joel, por favor.
Ok, tá joia. Obrigado, Marcos. Boa noite.
Tudo bom, Joel?
Tudo jóia, abração. Good night, Roderick. Thanks for your brilliant books, and thank you for this genius lecture you delivered today. My question is, the movement of enchantment, disenchantment, and re-enchantment of the world could be understood as a movement of the introversion or extroversion of the cultural libido. And the second question is, who did utter the spell? Thank you.
So what was the second part of the question? Who
did utter, U-T-T-E-R, the spell?
Who undid it, or who?
Yes.
Who undid it? Mm.
Yes.
Right. Well, the first part of your question, could it be seen as a sort of sort of way of thinking about the introversion and extroversion of cultural libido. I think that's a very interesting way of putting it. It's another, a bit like we would, with Marcus's question, it shows another way of thinking about this sort of dynamic that could be very, very helpful. I mean, I hadn't thought about it that way in particularly, but I suppose it does make, to me, it makes a lot of sense that one might. The sort of, yeah, the sort of different movement, the sort of, I suppose, yeah, I mean, that's certainly something. I mean, to me, that sounds plausible and interesting, and something I would think further about. Yeah, so thank you for that. Who undid the spell? I suppose who made the spell as well, and who undid it. I mean, in a sense, one of the very interesting things I think about the work that I quoted from by Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, in a Secular Age, is that he spends in his 900-page book a huge amount of time showing how he's talking about, he calls it secularity, but he does also talk about disenchantment, the disenchanted condition of modernity, how that came about from 500 years previously, where it didn't previously exist. He says that basically we in the West invented it. We invented the disenchanted condition, or secularity, the immanent worldview, and he refers to, he calls it the great invention of the West. That in a sense, this is why when he talks about the subtraction story, that this view that one often encounters, that religion, that's an invention, a fantasy, we've got rid of that, and now we're just left with what's left over, the reality. We've woken up into reality. He says this is not, this is not the right way to see it. That in fact, this reality that we've woken up into, this disenchanted condition, is itself a construction, is itself something that we've made in the ways in which we've sort of disciplined and conditioned our thought over hundreds of years in terms of developing ways of thinking, styles of thinking, and so on. So who cast the spell is that we cast the spell on ourselves culturally. I mean, what deeper archetypal or other cultural processes or processes of the introversion and extroversion of libido might have been behind that, or operative within that, is another story. But in a sense, certainly it's as Taylor would see it, it's a construction, and I think Jung would also see it that way, actually. As for who undid it or who can undo it, I mean, there's lots of, there have been lots of attempts to undo or break the spell of disenchantment, and lots of irrationalist movements, lots of people rejecting what disenchantment seems to represent. Many of them, I think, are unsatisfactory because they are regressive movements, or they're movements that swing from the one-sidedness of disenchantment to the one-sidedness of a presumed re-enchantment, which in reality turns out often just to be a reversion or a regression to naive enchantment. So this is what I think is very interesting about Jung's approach, is that he takes on board disenchantment. He doesn't reject critical consciousness and the achievements of the Enlightenment and of what's happened. He may lament the one-sidedness that's resulted. Many times he does, but he also says that he thinks it was necessary, and that when one proceeds further, I think he suggests that into this sort of what I suppose what might, a cultural individuation, an individual individuation, or a cultural individuation. What I would refer to in the terms of this talk as a sort of a re-enchantment. That is not something that you can do lightly. That is a very, very arduous, difficult, dangerous process. And he talks about how in order to do that, you have to stake your whole being, commit yourself entirely. He talks about the art requiring the whole person. So it's not something that comes easily. And I think, I'm sure there are other people and there are other ways. I think anybody actually individually who is being true to themselves and is realizing themselves individually is getting, is moving in that sort of direction. So in a sense, we're all breaking the spell at different times and in different ways, to different degrees. But I think it's when it's hard and difficult, and often on the far side of a lot of suffering, that this work takes place. So I don't know if that sort of in some way answers it. I mean, so what have I said? That I think Jung is breaking the spell, but I think we all are, insofar as we make some sort of movement in deepening our in advancing our individuation.
Thank you.
Obrigado, Joel. Martinha, você, querida.
Oi, boa noite. Primeiro, obrigada aí pela palestra, muito boa. De uma certa maneira, assim, o que eu ia perguntar, eu acho que você acabou respondendo agora para o Joel, né? Porque eu estava muito interessada também em falar sobre essa questão do reencantamento, né? Que muitas vezes pode ser vivido muito como uma coisa mais, usando um pouco o Deleuze, né? Seria mais de forma mecânica e não maquínica, né? Quer dizer, como se uma coisa eu vou ter que... Agora também é moda a gente se reencantar, e aí a gente faz isso como uma simples imitação, mas não como um processo, né? Então, de uma certa maneira, acho que você já falou sobre isso, não sei se a gente pode fazer essa comparação mesmo do maquínico e mecânico, como esse impulso, mas a individuação como esse estado maquínico, aí, o inconsciente, né? E que a mera repetição fica mecânica, né? Quer dizer, fica exatamente o contrário desse processo, né? Então, é só isso, porque você já falou, não sei.
Well, thank you very much for that formulation, which is helpful to me. Yeah, I mean, I think, as you say, there's a lot of mere imitation of things that seem to be re-enchanting, but in a sense are not really transforming anything. And I think it can be very useful to have ways of distinguishing between forms of, as it were, seeming enchantment, which are re-enchantment, which are not really re-enchanting, and something that is as it were doing the real work. Deleuze, of course, is a very profound thinker in these areas, who, when I was working on doing some work on him, I was very much enlightened, but also fascinated by how much he resonates with Jung, and also was secretly, because he wasn't very explicit about it, was secretly influenced by Jung. So yeah. But anyway, thank you very much for that. It's helpful.
Obrigada a você.
Obrigado, Martinha. Roderick, duas últimas perguntas, tá? Vou fazer uma, vou te pedir para responder, depois eu faço a final. Você citou o Gigres, né? Wolfgang Gigres, e ele tem um texto onde ele fala do desencantamento, e ele faz uma hipótese de que há dois Jungs, o Jung de Kursnacht e o Jung de Bollerhan, né? Como se Kursnacht fosse o Jung do desencantamento e Bollerhan o Jung do encantamento. Essa é uma posição que você confirmaria, que você acha razoável que esses dois lugares geográficos, esses dois lugares míticos, Bollerhan e Kursnacht, podem representar momentos de desencantamento e encantamento dentro do pensamento do Jung?
Well, I mean, I think that there's certainly something in that. It's you know, and I have read that, you know, the Wolfgang Gigerich's paper where he makes these claims, and he makes a very subtle and quite powerful case. What I find not quite, you know, what I don't quite sort of agree with in what he said is that I mean, he's talking about enchantment on the one hand and disenchantment on the other. I think it's important to be able to further differentiate the notion of enchantment into naive enchantment and re-enchantment. You know, so I think Gigerich criticizes Jung. I mean, he refers to him as having a disenchantment complex and not having fully got over some of his own enchantments, not having fully disenchanted himself, as it were. Well, I mean, it may well be that there are aspects of Jung's personality of which that is true, you know, because we're all sort of not fully getting, you know, which of us is fully individuated. So there may be aspects of his personality of which that's true. But I think there are, you know, to suggest that everything that smacks of enchantment in Jung is a form of naive enchantment, I think is a mistake, because I think Jung was also, there is also this sort of re-enchantment, this sort of deeper process which goes beyond disenchantment, which is not one of it's a sort of a post-critical consciousness, if you like, that can be reached. That is not one that is just a sort of a flight from the sort of austerities of being a grown up in the world, you know, but is actually a deeper engagement with reality, a more participatory and even unitary relationship with reality, which is one that you can't have unless you're disenchanted or have been disenchanted, and you know, unless you have a strong critical consciousness. It almost presupposes it, but it's not that critical consciousness, it's beyond it, if you like. So I think there's a lot that I sort of agree with and find very powerful in what Wolfgang Gigerich is saying, but I think that you know, I think there is this concept of re-enchantment as something beyond a naive enchantment, which is missing in that sort of straightforward dichotomy that he makes between Kuznacht and Bollingen. I think there's, you know, Jung may have been fleeing from the disenchanted world of Kuznacht when he went to Bollingen, but at other times I think he was not fleeing from it. I think he probably was going there to do even tougher things and more difficult things than he was doing in Kuznacht, and things that required every bit of the critical and sort of engaged, worldly engaged personality that he had in Kuznacht, and he had to take them into his solitude to do work with them that was just deeper work. No.
Tá. Obrigado. Queria te fazer a última pergunta, Roderick. Amanhã, aqui no Brasil, 2 grupos junguianos vão fazer um evento sobre o livro do Hillman, O Terrível Amor pela Guerra. Nós vamos nos reunir para discutir esse texto. Eu te perguntaria, a guerra é uma experiência de desencantamento ou de encantamento? Qual a sua opinião?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it could. I mean, I don't know. It could be. Surely, it could be. It could involve all aspects of the process I've been talking about. I mean, predominantly, I know. I mean, I know the paper that you're referring to of Hillman's, and he, he makes some, very challenging, offers some very challenging perspectives, and so on. And in fact, one of my colleagues at the University of Essex is also running a reading group on the same book at the moment. But in relation to enchantment, disenchantment, re-enchantment, I mean, some people, I mean, in some cases, war does have this, I mean, as Hillman points out, does have this archetypal fascination, and it can grip one, and people can get sort of, can blindly be drawn into it, as whole peoples can. I mean, it's a tremendously powerful factor, the sort of, whatever this sort of lust is for war. So it can be profoundly enchanting. Obviously, once you're in a war, there's a lot that happens that is profoundly disenchanting. I one would like to think that some of the people behind the present war in Ukraine might be beginning to feel a bit disenchanted, but perhaps not enough at this so far. As for to gain a sort of the sort of fascination that might draw one into or attract one to war, to be disenchanted of that would be a to my mind would be a kind of a positive thing. I mean, maybe there's a phase, I don't know, where one also needs in some way to integrate whatever the enchantment was alongside the disenchantment into some sort of more re-enchanted perspective. What that perspective would be, I don't know, but it might be something of that Hillman refers to and seems to like, which is this idea of the statement of Heraclitus of what is it in the Greek, sort of polemos pater panton or something, war is the father of all, and that's obviously a principle of a high level of abstraction. I don't know whether Heraclitus was recommending that if you want to be generative you should go to war, or whether he was saying that he was talking more about the conflict of opposites being generative in some way, and maybe if one can internalize that as a sort of as a principle in some way, in our psychic processes, maybe if we can do that, then maybe the sort of the impulse to act out conflict might be less likely to happen. I don't know, but yeah. I mean, I don't pretend on an issue of this scale to have anything really very valuable to sort of offer, but yeah, that's all I would really have to say, I think.
Obrigado. Aqui no Brasil, a tradução desse fragmento do Heráclito foi: a polêmica é o pai de tudo. Alguns traduzem como uma guerra, outros traduzem como uma polêmica. Polemos.
All right, controversy. Controversy. All right, that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe this is it. Maybe controversy is. Yeah. Okay. It may well be. I mean, maybe in the context, that's what it meant more.
Roderick, muito obrigado. Obrigado pela tua presença, pela tua generosidade, são 10h30 da noite, eu acho, aí, né, na Inglaterra. Sua participação foi bastante rica, muitas questões para a gente pensar. Estamos engajados aqui num processo de reencantamento, um reencantamento sincero, verdadeiro, não falso, não da ordem da imitação. Espero que a gente consiga ser bem-sucedido. Foi um prazer te receber. Muito obrigado.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. It was a great pleasure to present here, and also to hear your questions, and which were very, very thought-provoking and good questions, and which I'll be continuing to think about. So thank you very much.
Obrigado. Espero que a gente possa se ver novamente em breve. Um grande abraço para você. Bom fim de semana.
Okay, yes, that would be very nice. Okay, you too. Okay, bye then. Bye.
Pessoal, obrigado. Mais um Tiaços. Já deixamos aqui o convite para o próximo sexta-feira. Um Tiaços importantíssimo. Andrew Samuels, Vera Valente, discutindo Jung, antissemitismo e nazismo. Os corajosos venham assistir, tá bom? Bom final de semana. Obrigado a todos. Martinha, beijo.
Um abraço, Marcão.
Tchau, Joel. Tudo de bom. Isa, obrigado pela ajuda de sempre.
Até amanhã.
Beijo.
Outro. Tchau.